Welcome back to the Breakpoint Show. It is May 13th, 2025. And we're back with a guest because we're going to have a new kind of process. We're going to have an episode of just the three of us talking about something, and then we're going to have a guest. That way, we always have something interesting to talk about. We're kind of boring. So we no, Khalid's not boring.
Hey, come on.
Martin's boring, but no.
What?
But we've kind of run out of subjects, so we're trying to bring people on to talk about different things. And before we get into talking to Andrew, please go down and like this episode, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. I just watch so many other YouTube videos that I'm picking up the lingo. But yeah, so subscribe. If you're listening to this on a podcast aggregator like Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or any of the Google, subscribe to us, share with your friends that you like us. We are talking to Andrew Locke today. And Andrew, I want to thank you for writing that blog post a few weeks ago, or blog posts a few weeks ago about our dependency injection discussion. We were just kind of being wild and thinking outside the box, but you kind of picked it up and actually implemented some of the DI ideas that we had.
Yeah, it was interesting. I hadn't really considered the various options he had put forward. So it's just, got my brain ticking. Figured I'd play around with it. I spent too long actually trying to get it to work, I have to say.
We all do.
Like, I've got to draw a line somewhere. And I'm just going to write this up and leave it.
Yeah. See, it's a testament to your brain, Andrew. You're not as deranged as us, so you'd never crossed your mind ever. That's like, oh wow, we could do this.
On the other hand, we were thinking we could do this, but then Andrew actually did it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
We're the idea guys. We don't
actually
do the
but
work.
The implementers are the real powers. So
it's a team. It's a team.
So Andrew, tell our audience a little about yourself, and then we'll get into what we're going to be talking about today.
Oh yeah, so I'm Andrew Locke. I live in Plymouth and Devon in the UK, and I've been working with ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core for I don't know a lot of years now. I really got into ASP.NET Core just as it was sort of coming out, the sort of 1.0 release time. Started blogging a lot about it because I was just trying to learn more. As I was digging into bits of the framework, reading some of the source code, understanding how things worked, and then just rewriting it as blog posts was a way of me learning about it. But people probably have mostly heard about me from the blog, and then coming out of that as well was I wrote ASP.NET Core in Action, which is with Manning book. And so that's mostly been what I do in the sort of the community side.
Awesome. Yeah, love your ASP.NET Core books. So those are really good. So awesome. And then we'll have all of Andrew's links in the show notes. But today we're going to be talking about source generators in C#. So anyone have a kickoff question for Andrew?
No, I mean,
let's start with a simple one, maybe. That is, what are source generators?
Yeah, so the source generators are essentially a plugin for the C# compiler. They're a way for you to write code and to run analyzers. Essentially, they use a lot of the same infrastructure as C# analyzers do, to then generate additional C# code, which is then included into your project. So you can do all sorts of fancy things with that, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But fundamentally, it uses like the same analyzer infrastructure, which has been around in .NET Core for a long time and in normal .NET.
Yeah, that's kind of source generator is interesting. It's like a continuation of like the idea that .NET needs a metaprogramming language to kind of like program the programming language. You know, it's like with .NET, we started off with like T4 templates. Then we got to like maybe attribute and reflection based approaches. I think Codesmith. Does anybody remember Codesmith?
Yeah.
Yeah, like they had a generation framework. I think today we have like Post Sharp and their Metalama stuff too. So metaprogramming has always kind of been this dragon .NET's been chasing, and it's interesting to finally see it inside of .NET in the form of source generators. So I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, exactly. They're all slightly different. They all work in slightly different ways, run at slightly different times. I think I'm not exactly sure what was the progenitor of the original source generators, because I think it was .NET 5 they were first added, and I'm not entirely sure what the use case was specifically then, but I know very shortly afterwards they rewrote the Razor or Blazor compiler even to use source generators. Originally it was an external task, so all of your C# is then just compiled by a separate MS build task. And then subsequently they rewrote that to use a source generator, which gives a bunch of additional benefits in terms of, I think, mostly performance, and like the build is just simpler if you can just have it part of it.
Yeah. So Andrew, like what was your first experience with like source generators? And as a follow-up, like what's your most recent experience with source generators, and what problem did it help you solve?
Yeah, I first started to play with them just out of interest to see what they were for. And the one thing that came to mind is they were originally proposed as a way to sort of avoid runtime reflection. If you can analyze your code at build time and generate all of the code you need at build time, you can avoid the sometimes expensive reflection of runtime. And so I started writing this experimental enum-based source generator. So that would, it's one of those things that people don't necessarily know, but calling toString on an enum is actually surprisingly expensive in .NET. It doesn't seem like it should be. And basically using the source generator, I rewrote the calls so that instead of having a toString, you can call toString fast, and it would use a compile time constant to generate the string instead of using all of the normal reflection that the underlying, at that time, underlying system was quite slow. They've actually improved that quite a lot since .NET 8, so there's fewer reasons for it, but I've still been just sort of plowing away on that and like experimenting with various things.
Cool.
So that was definitely the first experiment, and it's when I started trying to explore all the different aspects of writing a source generator. Like creating the source generator itself is one thing, but then how do you test it? How do you run integration tests with it? How do you make sure you haven't broken anything?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I always find in the .NET space, like there's always a focus on getting something functional out first, but the machinery around it, like you're saying, like test harnesses and test suites and test tooling, those always feel like an afterthought in the .NET space. And you're right. And source generators definitely felt like, okay, how the heck do I test any of this stuff? Like other than just hitting compile all the time, which is really, really painful. So, but yeah.
Yeah. And one of the difficulties with source generators as well is that it's not just a compile time feature, it's also a design time in the IDE feature. So one of the niceties is you can do some source generation, generate some code in the background, and then you can actually hit F12 in Rider or Visual Studio, and it will navigate to this file which doesn't exist. It doesn't exist anywhere other than memory, but it's there. And as you're making changes in your normal code and the source generator is running and updating that code, it's all changing there. So that is another big aspect, is that the fact that the compiler is running every time you type a key can be very expensive on your CPU in your computer as you're working there. So if you do it wrong, suddenly everything can grind to a halt. And it's actually a trouble they found with the original source generator design, because they wrote JSON source generator, and it basically crippled Visual Studio. Like, as far as I can tell, like, as soon as you're doing anything in a big solution, it just ground to a halt. So that's kind of where they had to rewrite the whole design of source generators to be incremental and have this layer of caching built in.
So a very tangential question and probably way too deep into the weeds, but this got me thinking, like if you run source generators at design time, does it mean they run on every keystroke? And since your code is not complete at that point, the analyzer will probably also not have a complete view of what you're trying to generate. So is there any way to still make them work, or is this all solved by the caching that is there and to sort of make it work best effort based on the previous run?
So they do run every keystroke, depending on how you've designed them. There's a few helpers which they added in subsequent versions of the .NET SDK, which would sort of take care of a lot of those issues for you. You just sort of, it's particularly geared around if you're going to put an attribute on a class, then it takes care of making sure that it's not running when it's for all of the types in your application, for example. It's only going to run your source generator where it actually needs to be. So you can do fewer checks. You can make more assumptions about the compiler optimizing these things for you. But fundamentally, it's mostly just caching in that sense. It just avoids rerunning subsequent steps if it knows that the inputs haven't changed, which means that it's quite important that your functions are essentially pure functions, that you don't have anything in there that's going to change subsequently, that all of the outputs are governed by the inputs.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, like you bring up IDEs and kind of caching and performance. Martin and I were on the Rider team and ReSharper team, and I distinctly remember the first time seeing source generators, the implementation in Rider, and since for folks who don't know, Rider uses like an external out of process Roslyn process to kind of process the Roslyn-y stuff. ReSharper is a different C# engine. So it kind of communicates with this other process. But when source generators came out, we first were depending on the physical files that were being dropped into the obj folder. And it was like really, really slow. But I remember like you're bringing up the point that source generators, while we think of it logically as one thing, it definitely has seen an evolution from its first iteration to where it is today. Do you think there's anything left for source generators to iterate on? Do you think like there's another feature that's missing that could make it easier for people to consume?
I think there's certainly features that could be added in terms of making it easier to do the right thing. In .NET 7, I think it was, they added this helper, which and you could just add an attribute and it would give you what you expected. That solved a huge number of performance issues, for example. Mm-hmm. I think there's definitely scope for adding more things like that. There's the fundamental new feature they added in .NET 8, 9, I can't remember, of interceptors, mm-hmm. which is like it's all powered by source generators, really. They're only designed to be used by source generators now. But that's an entirely new feature, and that could do with a lot of the same love in terms of getting extra helpers to make sure that your performance isn't taking a hit the same way.
Mm-hmm.
So source generators have been around for a while now. Where do you think they are going? Like .NET, of course, is adopting them. Do you see other customers and open source projects and so on also adopting them? And what's the cool approaches to using a source generator that you've seen so far?
Yeah, I think there's lots of places where people are starting to use them now. The .NET BCL is definitely where you see them the most in all of the extensions, and then ASP.NET Core is making heavy use of them. You kind of have to use them if you want to be native AOT compatible and you are currently doing any sort of reflection. So I think frameworks, more so than libraries, will likely need to lean on source generators. I know in my day-to-day work, we have several source generators we use just because they're kind of handy. Like they can gain you performance with relatively little overhead in terms of maintenance and things like that. And for the most part, we found they just work. once you've got over the initial hurdles of the fact they are conceptually much harder to work with. Like anytime you're working with the Roslyn APIs, they're not designed for just general developers. They are definitely designed for people who are somewhat in the weeds of things. I was trying to think of other places I've seen them. The Nuke build system, which we use, that has a source generator for which it reads your solution file and it generates a strongly typed list of your products, of your projects inside the solution and things like that. So that makes it easier to reference things, and it just improves the general developer experience when you can plug these source generator things in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you bring up a good point about another project that I think a lot of people are focusing on now. Aspire does the same thing, right? So
Yep.
you add dependencies to the app host, and then a source generator will see those dependencies and give you strongly typed references to those projects and stuff like that. So that seems to be a pattern that's growing in .NET. It's an interesting one. We're kind of slowly moving away from XML files and, demonic SLN files with those GUIDs to something that's more code over configuration. So it's kind of nice.
Cool.
I think in that example in particular, you think about what it would be without the source generator. The answer is probably just, well, you'd have a string, and you'd have to make sure the string matches the name of the project. And so it's not like it's doing anything revolutionary in a lot of ways, but it just avoids those cases where you're like, oh, why isn't this working? Oh, because I've got a typo in this string and I don't know why. And so it saves a lot of those cases. So it's like this sort of performance, developer experience, those are the two main cases I see.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yeah,
And native compatibility. Sorry. Yeah.
That's software development, right? Like we could do everything manually, but the idea is the more we can automate, the more we can kind of not think about things, the more productive we are in the long run. So yeah, it's like you could hand wave source generators away as like, maybe this isn't necessary, but sometimes it's nice to have nice things. So yeah.
So here's a question: when should you not use a source generator? Have you found use cases that they don't work well in?
So I think fundamentally there's an overhead to building and maintaining a source generator. So I don't feel like they're ever your go-to solution for most situations. It's normally a situation like, oh, this is really tedious to maintain. We have to remember to update this thing in 4 different places whenever we make this change. Or, oh, if we don't do this, something else is going to break and it's not really obvious. Using a source generator to just automate all that away can pay off in the long run if you're something you're doing often. So I think it's like a lot of automation things, I think.
Yeah.
If automating it is going to save you time in the long run, then it's worth doing. But there is an overhead to writing a source generator.
Sure.
They're not simple.
So you could tell I'm not a big expert in source generators, so trying to get into that. But one thing that I've always been interested in is, could source generators be used to allow an application to have different aspects for the 3 operating systems that .NET generates down to, so Windows and Mac OS and Linux. I've always been interested if you could kind of generate code specifically for one or more OSs.
Yeah, I think there's nothing to stop you doing that at all with source generators. Fundamentally, the output of a source generator is just C# code. So if it's something you could do in normal C# and you just don't want to write that by hand every time because it's a pain, that's a good use case for it.
Yeah.
They don't for the sort of bog standard source generators, they don't give you new capabilities. They give you the ability to automate.
Just generate. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, to your question, Chris, like I could see source generators being a boon for, people building cross-platform tooling. So Uno platform, Avalonia folks, the Maui folks, they're constantly having to bridge between .NET into the host operating system of iOS, Android. So if they could write a source generator that just looks at those APIs and generates idiomatic C#, I think that's a big win for a lot of those teams. So I could see source generators being good there. So yeah.
Yeah.
Andrew, a question for you. Chris mentioned he's a beginner with source generators. I'm kind of a beginner too. Every time I dabble in source generators, I come back to it months later and I've forgotten everything. Is there like a set of tools or techniques that you use to kind of build and maintain source generators that you would recommend to somebody getting started with it?
Yeah, it's one of the big sort of bugbears of mine at the moment. Actually, there's just not that much around for source generators in terms of documentation, getting started guides, things like that. Mm-hmm. There's in the Roslyn repository, there's a cookbook for which talks about all the various different sort of low-level-ish APIs that are available to you for source generators and how to do some things. And there's a few samples in there you can use, but they are somewhat limited as to what you can get from those. In general, I actually would just say read my series on incremental source generators because
shameless self-promotion, Andrew.
Yeah. Well, that's why he's on the show. So yeah.
No, go ahead. Sorry, just kidding.
Well, no, it's in that. Basically, that just summarizes what I found when I was getting started, and I don't think there's a huge number of like official help and documentation about it. A lot of it does come from other people working with them, and most people are doing this open source. Like I've got several source generators that are open source, so you can just go in there and look and just see how it works. Yeah. There's various other people have done these as well, and that's the easiest way I find to get started.
So I just found this repository called Awesome Source Generators, or C# Awesome Source Generators, and there's a tool in there called Gobi that allows you to essentially write your source generator as a string, so you don't have to fiddle with all of the Roslyn specific syntax trees and all that. So you can just write a string and it will apply it to the right place where you attributed your code with a custom attribute from Gobi. So that's looks quite cool, actually.
That is cool.
That is cool.
Yeah, I will say my experience with source generators, the most difficult part is just like, you typically with a source generator have a target, like it's either a class or an attribute or a particular method, and trying to actually get the abstract syntax tree selector to get to that element and find those elements, I think has always been the most challenging part of it. There is a tool, an extension for Rider that will show you the path to that particular element in your C# code. So you can like click it in your actual code and it'll give you that. And then you can copy that path into your source generator. I find that super helpful. That plugin still needs a little bit of work, but it's a good starting point for trying to figure out, okay, how do I get to this particular thing? Do you find that challenging, Andrew, or is it just me? Maybe, yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, I use that exact same thing in Rider. I write the code that I want it to hit, and then I look at the IL visualizer. Is it the IL? No, I can't remember. The syntax visualizer. Mm-hmm. In fact, is it still a plugin? I thought maybe it was.
Oh, I think it's bundled in now. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And so yeah, absolutely that. The other thing that I like to do is very early on, before I have done anything really, is write a unit test using Microsoft. So they've got a bunch of extension test libraries for working with source generators. And so you can run the source generator just as a normal unit test with X unit, N unit, whatever you want. You provide it a string, which is the sort of source code that you're providing, and then you provide it what you expect it to generate out at the other side, and that way you can step through your source generator as well. You can probably just easily just debug it without having to fire up another version of your IDE to have it running in real time or anything like that. So just step through debugging, and I can see the code that it's actually, what syntax has it actually received, and then easily just iterate it like that. Even just using the edit and continue and debugger, you can write it as you go. So I find that quite useful as well.
Yeah, that's super cool. Is the test framework test suite agnostic? Like, does it work with XUnit, NUnit, or is it specifically like MS Test or anything like that?
Yeah, so there's an abstractions library, I believe, which you can use with any, and then there's specific versions for XUnit, NUnit, MS Test. I think it's just those three, which you can then easily plug into.
Yeah. I mean, but before we move on from unit testing, I know that someone on the Microsoft.NET team is currently building TUnit, which is a test framework built on source generators. So it's kind of like it's the snake eating its tail in that sense.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to think about building your unit tests so that they're AOT compatible, so that you could essentially like run them anywhere without a lot of dependencies. I find that really interesting. So that's a use case.
I mean, one thing I was just thinking about while we're talking is, you have so many external third-party APIs that seem to change over time that it would be interesting if source generators could, and I don't know if this is possible, so I'm just dreaming up ideas. We're the Idea podcast. If at compile time it went out and looked at all of the third-party APIs, like REST APIs or whatever, and then if there was any changes, if it would kind of bring those in and adjust your source code because of those API changes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that would be interesting. The only concern I'd have with that is, like we were saying before, is source generators running on every keystroke.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'd want having a network hit in each of
that's
those.
True.
So
that's true.
It may be something. What you certainly could do is have a task which runs at your compile time, which then pulls the OpenAPI document, for example, and then you could use the OpenAPI document to drive your source generators.
Yeah.
That's up to
exactly. So, okay. Well, you just made my idea more intelligent. So thank you, Andrew. So,
it's interesting. Like when I look at source generators and compare it to other ecosystems, like the JavaScript ecosystem with tools like Vite. Vite has both a development time experience and a build time experience. Do you think for source generators, does it make sense to draw that line in the sand where you would have a development time experience that's optimized so that you can get work done as a developer, but then change the behavior to optimize for the build? Or do you think that's just asking for trouble in the .NET ecosystem?
Yeah, so technically there's a switch you can change in the source generators to say this doesn't affect your sort of design time build. Like, so that's something where you don't have to care about like F12ing onto your generated code to see it. Technically that switch exists, but as I understand it, none of the IDEs like respect it. They all just always run at design time because basically it's hard. Like if people use that switch and then suddenly code doesn't compile, which looks like it should compile, because there is a distinction between an interactive build running as part of Visual Studio or Rider, just your normal flow, so that it can generate IntelliSense and things like that, and then the actual build, which is what's producing the artifacts. And I don't know if it makes sense to differentiate those. Historically, they have been somewhat more differentiated, and that's often the source of basically bugs in IDEs and things. When you're in Visual Studio or something, and all of your colorization goes wonky, and like half of your Blazor is using HTML syntax and things like that.
Yeah.
That's normally where these two things have got out of sync, where the Visual Studio thinks it's working with a certain code DOM and it's not. So I don't know. It's difficult. It's. I know the sort of experience that you're talking about with Node, and it would be interesting. I don't know if it's feasible or not, and I don't know how much we would gain.
Yeah, I think you're right. You know, when I think about the Node experience, it's really done to optimize that hot reload dev experience that folks are used to in that space. And sadly, in .NET, we don't actually have a very good hot reload experience. So, you know, if we do get there someday, maybe that kind of switch between dev and build time would make a lot of sense. But we're just still not there yet. And hopefully, maybe .NET 11. Turn the knobs to 11, and then we'll get everything we ever wanted.
So that brings up an interesting question. Do you think that source generators will ever be like part of the actual compiler, or will they always be like plugins? And because it would be interesting to have it as like part of the compiler itself.
I think by design they're going to stay. They will stay as. Yeah, I can't see. I don't know. I'm not sure. So there's various, because there's a bunch of source generators built into the BCL. Like there's ones for regex, and there's ones for making p-invoke calls and things like that. And there's sort of no reason that they couldn't be baked in to the compiler.
Okay.
But then I guess, what do they gain? If you by having it as a plugin and having those well-defined interfaces, you take a little bit of a hit in terms of performance.
Yeah.
But then you gain all of that additional flexibility that they can iterate on those. They can update them with newer versions, and you can pin to specific ones. So if you don't want the newer versions, you can pin those in a lot of cases.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just trying to think, and I mean, I'm still back in the age where I remember T4 and generating code from that was the big entity framework stuff. Was, hey, just create a T4 and have it kind of generate from that. But yeah.
Well, I think there probably is a T4 source generator in which you provide the T4 template and it uses that to generate source. I can't remember, but I have a vague.
I'm sure someone
there is.
Create there. Yeah, someone. It's probably out on GitHub someplace.
That feels like a Baj to me. Like, oh my god, you're just band-aiding things together. Oh, what could go wrong?
This is programming.
Hey, it compiles, push it to production. It's fine. It's going to be okay.
We'll see what happens.
Yeah. Speaking of production, last week we talked about open source projects and kind of like where the .NET ecosystem is. You know, source generators and this kind of push to go towards AOT, I think creates kind of like a paradigm shift or like a existential moment for the .NET open source ecosystem, because there's going to be a clear delineation between things that heavily use reflection and that's how they provide their solutions, and then the things that ultimately use source generators to provide similar solutions as well. I think a good one that sticks out in my brain is like mapping, right? You have AutoMapper, but now you're seeing a lot of people write source generators to do compile time mapping based on source generators. So, I mean, have you thought about this issue, and like, what do you think it'll actually end up doing to .NET's open source ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's exactly the problem you describe. I think I suspect there will be a very small subset of libraries ultimately which have the resources, the knowledge in order to use source generators to replace these various reflection approaches. A big chunk of those will just be in Microsoft BCL, like the JSON approach that is basically replaced using source JSON in terms of native AOT at least. And I think that will continue to just be essentially a handful of libraries which have it, which I'm sure it will be essentially the most used libraries will likely make that jump, partially because people will clamor for it, partially because there are sort of people probably who would be interested in doing that. And so it will always, to my mind, you'll have this bifurcation. I can't see like that the whole ecosystem is going to move across to native AOT support. I mean, we haven't even got nullable reference types in most of the libraries as far as I can work out. And so I just can't see that hard lift being made.
Man, a bunch of .NET developers out there just got gut punched. They're like, oh yeah, my nullability is pretty bad in my project. I really should go back and fix those things.
I mean, the trouble is that a lot of the time it's nullability is another sort of slight bugbear in that half the frameworks that Microsoft have got ASP.NET Core, they don't really support it. Like Razor Pages doesn't really work with nullability, and MVC sort of does, in places, but in other places it doesn't. And so, retrofitting it is hard work. And I think that's the same thing for native AOT. It's like MVC and Razor Pages are never going to support native AOT. That's just probably never going to happen.
Oh,
and so,
I'm heartbroken now.
Sorry, well, if they don't, and then how many developers are just using those rather than minimal APIs? Blades are made well down the line, I'm sure, because it sort of does already for the WebAssembly side. It's essentially native. Well, no, it doesn't. You can get around it. I've done it.
Look, Andrew, you just say whatever you want, and then the .NET team will do whatever you want them to do. This is how this
works. Is it?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
No, the way it works is you mention something on a podcast, and then this guy named Locke will write a blog post and implement it for you.
Yeah. Just do that. Just kind of go, hey, I wrote this blog post. Andrew, you have any thoughts on this? And he'll spend all of his extra time that he has, all that time to implement it. So Andrew, is there anything? I'm just kind of curious beyond source generators. Is there anything else that you're interested in? Maybe in .NET 9 or upcoming versions of .NET and C#? What kind of tickles you to use and to try out?
Yeah. So I mean, I haven't been paying a huge amount of attention to a lot of the new bits that have been coming out. I've been trying all these various other little bits here and there. I've been playing with some of the new AI templates that they've got because you have to play with AI. And
I knew we couldn't not go through an episode without saying those two letters. So yeah,
like kicking and screaming. I finally looked at the templates and. They're quite nice, to be fair. They're quite interesting. There's lots of bits to sort of dig into those. So I've been looking through those. In terms of actual C#, and then the whole extension, everything that's coming in the next C# 14 looks like nice syntactic sugar, basically, on things you can sort of essentially already do. I don't think it's like a big feature, but it's going to be nice. The new collection initializers was very interesting when they came out. I thought that was a very interesting way of providing continual performance improvements in subsequent versions of .NET without actually having to change your C# syntax. And then I think they're coming out for dictionaries very soon as well. So that's all quite interesting new bits that are coming up, which I look forward to digging into.
So I got to take it back. So we were talking about source generators, and we crossed the threshold and talked about AI. Is there any way to merge source generators and AI together? Have you thought about that?
I mean, I'm not the ideas person, so that's not.
Oh yeah. So okay, now go off and think about that, and yeah. So you can have a AI-driven source generator that I don't know. So
We have AI. It's called Andrew's intelligence, right? We
Yes.
just say our ideas, and he goes.
That's our AI,
and
Yep.
he spits out code that actually compiles, none of this vibe coding stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So,
No, I mean, I guess one last question for you about just in the space of source generators. It's like you mentioned there's going to be like you kind of looked into a crystal ball and predicted the future, which is there's potentially going to be a small set of packages. If you want to head towards the AOT future, a small set of packages that kind of provide you the solution you get. Do you think that's the inevitable future, or do you see a future where maybe that's where we start, and then once we've made the shift from reflection heavy solutions, people start imagining new solutions and new ways to do things built on top of source generators? Like what do you see the future being?
I think that's certainly possible. I think in some ways the question is, are source generators necessary for most people? And I think mostly the answer is no. Everyone likes faster code, but native AOT is definitely not going to be required by people. It's a great option if you're running things in AWS Lambdas or Azure Functions or things like that. But otherwise, do you gain much benefit for the pain that you have to put into it? Probably not. So if you're not doing native AOT, do you need to have fast, non-reflection based approaches? It's nice to have, but it's not required. And so I can't see it being much of a driver to force the sort of paradigm shift into this is how we do things now. I think one thing that would change is if suddenly there's a new feature introduced into core.net, which is if you're doing reflection, you don't need to do reflection anymore. Just use this attribute, and now it just works.
Mm-hmm.
And there are almost some bits like that which currently exist, and it's not source generators, but you can access like private fields of types you don't own without using reflection. I can't remember the name of the little attribute you add, but you can do things like this. And so if that's built into .NET and they happen to build in something similar, which just provides that new paradigm, I can then see that taking off. But I think the barrier to entry for writing your own source generator today is probably not going to take off.
Yeah, I guess my mental image of people who write source generators are those people in coal mines. Like they do the hard, dirty work for us so we can kind of all, have nice warmed houses, but you don't actually need to go down in the coal mine. So
but that's a thing, right? If you're writing a regex, for example, right now you're using a source generator without you even probably knowing about it. So
yeah,
that's how it works.
Exactly.
It's just
not everyone is going to have to write a source generator.
I just feel guilty, man. There's people suffering through source generators, and I'm taking advantage of it. It feels like it doesn't fit right with me.
Buy another copy of Andrew's book, and that'll help. But
I think we're coming up on time. Do you guys have any more questions for Andrew?
Andrew, if people want to kind of meet you in 3D, I always say meeting people in 3D. Where are you going to be speaking in the near future or for the rest of the year?
I mean, I don't really do.
You don't go to conferences and stuff?
I'm very much online book
gotcha.
And blog writing person.
Okay,
that's my thing.
Okay, I got you. You like to stay home, and so and you're young, so you probably have a family, so you like to.
I've got a dog downstairs. I've got a girlfriend.
Dog, okay.
So,
you want to stay home for the dog, so that's good.
Exactly.
So, awesome. So how is so for that? You have any upcoming books, or you just keep doing the ASP.NET Core book?
I mean, that feels like that's gonna be going forevermore. But
Yeah.
not right now. Not right now. No, I just
Okay.
just keep you up with the blog posts and keep you on top about them.
Okay, just trying to see if you're doing anything new that our audience would be interested in.
I mean, the blog is great, Andrew. I mean, I always
I
find
love the blog.
something
Absolutely,
insightful
yes.
every blog post you write. So, and I'll say this: it's like it definitely like reading your blog posts has pushed me to write more blog posts, and like a friendly community rivalry. It's like,
Yeah,
I'll
me
write a
too.
blog post. Andrew will write a blog post. So
Yeah,
I've always enjoyed your stuff.
you have motivated me this year to write a lot more. So
Yeah,
you're writing a lot more. I've seen that.
I'm trying to do a blog post today. So
it's a lot. It's a lot.
Well, yeah, yeah. Well, we could talk about that later, but yeah, I have my methods. So yeah, but I'm trying.
Well,
So
yeah.
Anything else? Any parting, Andrew? Do you have any parting thoughts before we wrap up?
I mean, let me talk about source generators. I think it's worth looking if you're interested in .NET in general and you'd like to see just if nothing else, seeing how the sausage is made. Like have a look at source generators just to get a feel for what they look like, and they don't have to be super complicated. So just give them a try.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Anything else you guys have?
No, I really appreciate Andrew coming on, and I'd love to have him in the future as well. Like I had a lot of fun asking questions of someone who's, added a lot to the .NET community. So I appreciate it.
Absolutely, yes.
So thank you, and we'll have Andrew on in the future, and we'll have lots of zingers for him, or we'll just keep adding wild ideas to our podcast episodes, and he kind of implement all those. So cool.
Yeah. All right. Well,
thanks very much.
Thanks everybody.
Bye everyone. See you
like
next
and subscribe.
time.
Bye.
Like. Bye.